Obama shut Trump down with just one line, and the internet is furious about it. The evening inside Philadelphia's historic Constitution Center had a strange electricity about it, a sense that something more than just a political forum was about to unfold. The lights blazed with almost surgical intensity, reflecting sharply off the polished hardwood floors and glinting in the lenses of dozens of cameras lined up like sentries along the back wall. This wasn't merely a gathering of citizens and journalists. It was a night the nation had been waiting for, one that promised confrontation, spectacle, and perhaps even a glimpse into the soul of its democracy. The event had been advertised as a serious discussion about the path forward for the United States, about how to preserve its democratic foundations in turbulent times. But everyone who managed to secure a seat knew the real draw: the unprecedented live meeting of Barack Obama and Donald Trump, two figures who represented vastly different versions of American leadership, seated on the same stage, before a live national audience. From the second they appeared, you could feel the air in the room shift. Obama's entrance was deliberate, his pace unhurried, his face a portrait of composed focus. He acknowledged the audience with a restrained wave, the same small gesture millions had seen him give from podiums around the world. Trump, in contrast, strode in as if the room were his to command, his chin tilted slightly upward, his shoulders squared like a man walking into a challenge he had already decided to win. The hall erupted into a clashing mix of cheers and jeers, a sound that surged to the ceiling beams and bounced back down in waves. Somewhere in the second row, a retired school teacher from Scranton leaned forward, her fingers locked tightly around the edge of her seat. A college student in the back was already live streaming, his phone held high as though history needed a second screen. Members of the press hunched over their pads, pens racing faster than the moderators could shuffle their notes. And it was still only the opening minute. Two veteran journalists sat between the men, tasked with a job that suddenly felt much heavier than any introduction could suggest. One of them leaned toward the microphone and, with practiced steadiness, laid out the evening's purpose: to explore the state of American democracy, to ask how it could be safeguarded, improved, and made more representative of every citizen's voice. Obama adjusted his tie and glanced at the audience before lowering his gaze to a set of notes he hardly needed. Trump tapped his fingers impatiently against the armrest, his eyes darting toward the crowd as if searching for the first cue to strike. It was a study in contrasts. One man prepared to build a conversation brick by brick, the other bracing for the moment to break through it. When Obama finally spoke, the hall hushed. His tone was measured, the cadence of someone speaking not just to a crowd, but to each individual in their living room, their kitchen, their truck cab on a night drive. The work of democracy, he said in that familiar low register, is never inherited whole. It's something each generation has to shape, patiently, carefully, day after day. The words carried a quiet strength, and for a heartbeat, the room listened as though leaning toward a warm fire. Then, with a sudden lean and a wave of the hand, Trump cut in. Yeah, we've heard all that before. His voice boomed across the hall, slicing through Obama's rhythm like a blade. A ripple of unease skittered across the rows. Some chuckled awkwardly, some groaned, and the moderators shot each other a glance that read, "Here it comes." Obama didn't flinch. He let the interruption hang, his expression as unmoved as a stone bench in the sun. The contrast was glaring. One figure holding steady, the other lunging forward, impatient to dominate the room. You could feel the audience begin to tilt, the early sense of deliberation giving way to something sharper, more combustible. The second interruption came even sooner, as if Trump had been waiting for a crack in the wall. Obama had just begun to explain why consistent leadership matters most during crises, why listening often outweighs shouting, when Trump leaned forward again, voice rising. "Respect. You talk about respect while you left our borders wide open, while jobs fled overseas. Don't lecture me on respect. You don't even understand the word." The hall erupted again, a mess of gasps, scattered claps, and stifled laughs. The moderators tried to interject, hands half raised like traffic cops at a runaway intersection, but the energy had already shifted. For the first time that evening, Obama turned to face Trump fully, not with anger, something far subtler. His thumb tapped the edge of the table, a silent metronome. "Donald," he said evenly, "if you're going to interrupt, at least let me finish the sentence." The response cracked through the tension like a whip. Laughter swelled into applause. filling the hall with the kind of noise that lifts a crowd to its feet. Trump smirked, perhaps sensing that even being chastised kept the camera where he wanted it, on him. The moderators pressed forward, granting Obama the floor once more. His voice never rose, never strained to outshout the chaos. "This isn't about winning the noise," he said, "and it's not about drowning each other out. It's about whether we can face what's in front of us. Issues that don't care which party is in charge, or who gets the last word." The line landed. You could see its impact on the faces scattered across the first few rows. A construction worker with his arms folded tight. A young mother clutching her purse. An older man nodding slowly as though the words had been overdue. But equilibrium in that hall was like a paper boat on a restless river. The moment Obama mentioned healthcare, the boat capsized again. Trump pounced. "Don't even start." Premiums went through the roof. Everyone hated it. You had your chance, and you blew it. The crowd split in two, groans and cheers colliding against the walls. Obama did not answer in kind. He leaned slightly toward Trump, voice steady as ever. "Donald, if people hated it as much as you say, you wouldn't still be talking about it 10 years later." That line cracked the room open again. A wave of laughter followed by applause that even some of Trump's supporters couldn't quite suppress. By the time the third interruption arrived, the debate had shed any pretense of quiet civility. Obama was midway through an explanation of how the balance between freedom and security had always tested the country, how every generation wrestled with that line. When Trump shot up again, finger aimed like a dart. "Freedom. You spied on Americans. You crushed freedom. You're the last person to preach about liberty." The hall tipped into chaos. Shouts, applause, jeers. The moderator's pleas drowned out by the din. What had begun as a forum was fast becoming a battlefield of sound. Obama waited, his hands folded, his gaze fixed not on the man across from him, but on the moderators trying to salvage the night. "If I may finish," he began, only to be cut again. "Finish what? Another excuse? Another story about how you always knew best? The country was tired of you, Barack. That's why we won." The word "won" clanged in the air like a gavel. Security guards along the wall straightened. The crowd buzzed with heat and motion. But Obama did not bite. He turned his head slightly, the faintest tilt of contemplation, and then delivered a line that shifted the ground under the evening. "Winning an election is one thing. Leading a country is another, and they are not the same." The response was a thunderclap. Applause rolled like a tide. A veteran in uniform dabbed at his eyes. A teenager gripped his father's arm, and a woman in her 70s mouthed the words as if they were her own. Trump fired back, louder now, his hands cutting the air. "Spare me the sermon. You gave us 8 years of weakness. The world didn't respect us. You made America small." The moderator's attempts to mediate vanished beneath the roar. Yet Obama, almost impossibly, remained composed. He waited, not to strike, but to let the frenzy burn itself out. Only when the hall settled into a restless quiet did he speak, softer than before, but with weight that carried further than volume ever could. "You know what makes this nation weaker?" he asked, scanning the rows. "It's when we start seeing each other as enemies instead of neighbors. When shouting replaces solving. That's not strength, that's surrender." The applause that followed was not just loud, it was decisive. Something in the room had turned. Even Trump seemed to sense it. He muttered into the microphone, waved a dismissive hand, and leaned back for the first time all night. That slip, that hesitation, was noticed by the moderators, by the crowd, by viewers in diners and living rooms across the country. The moderators seized the opening. "Let's move forward," one said firmly. "Each of you will have your full time." But everyone knew the truce would not last. Trump's interruptions were not calculated plays in a script. They were instinct, raw, unfiltered, relentless. And when the fourth one came, it would not simply break the rhythm. It would stretch the tension of that night to its breaking point. By the time the fourth interruption tore through the night, the air in the Philadelphia hall was charged like a thunderstorm about to break. What had begun as a tense but orderly discussion had swelled into something far more volatile. The audience was no longer a passive collection of viewers. They were participants now, leaning forward, reacting to every breath, every movement, every flicker of expression on the stage. The moderators, who had started the evening with composed authority, now looked like they were gripping the reins of a wild animal that refused to be steered. Their voices had taken on a firmer, sharper tone, attempting to impose structure on a conversation that was veering further and further from the rails. The question at hand was one that cut to the heart of the nation's unrest. How could America recover from years of bitter division? It was meant to be a chance for each man to speak to vision, to healing, to the work of bringing a fractured country back to some sense of unity. Obama leaned toward his microphone with the same calm cadence he had carried all night. Unity, he began, his tone even, doesn't require unanimous agreement. It means that even in disagreement, we hold a shared stake in this country's future. It means remembering that opponents are fellow citizens, not lifelong enemies. Lose that respect, and we lose far more than elections. We lose the very bonds that make us one nation. The room murmured in agreement, a soft applause rising like a tide, heads nodding here and there. But as had become the pattern, the quiet didn't last long. Trump jerked forward, his voice slicing across the words like a blade through cloth. Respect? You dare talk about respect while your administration targeted me, spied on me, tried to crush me at every turn? Don't preach to me about respect. You don't even grasp what it means. His hand cut through the air with each accusation, the microphone straining under the force of his words. Noise surged through the hall. Cheers from one side, boos from the other. For a moment, the great walls of the Constitution Center felt as if they might rattle with the vibration. Both moderators began speaking at once, their attempts at restoring order drowned in the uproar. Along the aisles, security shifted their stances, eyes scanning the restless crowd. Obama didn't fire back. Not immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly, resting his chin on one hand, his gaze locked on Trump with a look that was neither anger nor amusement, but something colder, assessment. The silence that followed was heavy, like the pause before a storm breaks. People in the first rows turned their heads toward one another, waiting for the inevitable reply. When it came, it was not a shout but a needle. Donald, Obama said, his voice light, yet laced with steel. If you truly believe the entire government bent its will and resources just to focus on you, that probably says more about the size of your ego than about any policy we ever had. The reaction was explosive. Applause and laughter rolled together, whistles rising from the balconies. Even one of the moderators couldn't suppress a brief smile before regaining her composure. Trump's jaw tightened. His fingers drummed a staccato rhythm on the desk, his head shaking, his lips forming the words, "Total disgrace." The microphones caught it, adding to the buzz that rippled through the hall. Obama allowed the noise to crest and fade before addressing the room, not his opponent. The danger isn't whether one man feels singled out, he said, his tone firm but not sharp. The danger is when we start believing that those who disagree with us are our enemies. That's when politics stops being debate and starts becoming war. And when that happens, families fracture, communities break apart, and we forget what we're here to protect in the first place. The words landed like a steady drumbeat. A man in a baseball cap stood to clap. A cluster of college students whistled from the balcony. Even those who had walked in skeptical of him found themselves pausing, taking in the steadiness that contrasted so starkly with the bluster at the other podium. But Trump was not the kind to retreat. He lunged back in, his volume climbing with each accusation. Don't twist this. You tore this country apart. You undermined law enforcement. You encouraged chaos in the streets. People turned to me because you failed them. The moderators raised their hands, one calling his name like a referee in a heated match. Mr. Trump, let him finish. Obama merely raised a palm slightly, signaling he could handle it. His voice, when it came, didn't harden. Donald, he said evenly, shouting about chaos doesn't make you the cure. Sometimes it just makes you part of the problem. The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming, applause rising into a standing ovation in parts of the hall. Trump leaned back, his face tightening as he scanned the crowd, his frustration visible now in the set of his jaw, the flicker of his eyes. Yet the night was only half spent. Everyone knew the interruptions would keep coming, each one sharper than the last. By the time the fifth and sixth cut through, the room was no longer reacting to arguments, but to a test of endurance, who would maintain command of the stage, and who would lose their footing beneath the weight of noise. The fifth interruption came during a segment on foreign policy, a topic where Obama, with his deliberate cadence and long arc view, often held the advantage. He was describing the value of alliances built on respect, on the kind of trust that makes allies stand with you in crisis rather than turn away. Strength, he said, is not measured by how. Strength? Trump thundered, lurching forward. You gave everything away. You bowed to foreign leaders. You let them walk all over us. I stood up to them. I made them pay their share. You didn't. His voice spiked so hard the speakers trembled. And once again the room fractured, half the crowd clapping, the other half groaning in exasperation. Obama didn't snap back. He turned briefly toward Trump, then back to the moderators, then leaned in, his voice a quiet counterpoint to the noise. Donald, he said, diplomacy isn't about walking in with a bill. It's about building trust, so that when the storm hits, those nations stand with us, not against us. That's what keeps America safe. This time, the applause wasn't playful. It was solid, deliberate, heavier than laughter, a sound of agreement that carried weight. Trump's eyes darted across the room, gauging the shift, and before Obama could continue, the sixth interruption cracked through like a whip. Trump slammed his palm on the desk, the sharp crack echoing through the hall. Safe? You left the world burning. Look at the Middle East. Look at North Korea. China. You weakened us. Everyone knows it. The hall roared with noise, cheers, boos, whistles clashing in the air until even the moderators' raised voices could barely cut through. Mr. Trump, please, allow him to finish, one of them shouted, nearly pleading. Trump didn't yield. He leaned in, eyes hard, hand gripping the microphone as if it were a weapon. Weak. That's what you were. Weak abroad. Weak at home. Weak everywhere. The word became a hammer, pounding the air. Obama didn't tense. He leaned back, loose at the shoulders, waiting. He let the roar of the room crest and ebb before speaking with a softness that carried further than the shouting ever could. If you measure strength by how loud a man yells, he said, then maybe you've mistaken noise for leadership. True strength is whether you leave a country stronger than you found it. The hall erupted again, not with chaos, but with a steadier, rolling applause that built and held. People rose from their seats, clapping with a kind of deliberate persistence. Some whistled. Others simply stayed on their feet, a tide of recognition moving through the rows. Trump forced a smile, his jaw tight, his grip still white-knuckled on the microphone. The moderators exchanged a glance of relief, as though a storm had momentarily passed. But that moment was only the eye of it. The room was now vibrating with something raw, not just tension, but anticipation. People knew another collision was coming. The fifth and sixth interruptions had stretched patience to its edge. Viewers at home, families in Michigan living rooms, truckers at diners in Ohio, patrons in Nevada bars, leaned closer, sensing that the night was building towards something that could define it. And then came the silence, the pause before the seventh moment that would change the night entirely. Obama didn't rush. He sat back, fingers resting lightly on the table, his gaze fixed somewhere between the crowd and the cameras. Trump fidgeted, tapping his fingers, tugging at his tie, glancing around as if to overpower the stillness with his presence alone. For the audience, the pause was magnetic. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Shifts in seats went still. It was the kind of waiting that thickened the air, that turned seconds into a held breath. Finally, Obama leaned toward the microphone, his voice almost conversational. You know, he said, his eyes flicking toward Trump. Interruptions don't make a point stronger. They just make it louder. The response was instant. Applause. A ripple of laughter. Shouts of agreement rising from the edges of the room. Trump forced a smirk, leaned back, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the hit. Obama let the moment stretch, then spoke again, each word deliberate. When I was in office, I learned something. If you spend all your time cutting people off, you leave no room to actually hear them. And if you can't hear, you don't learn. And if you don't learn, you can't lead. This time the applause was different. Not chaotic, not fleeting, sustained. It carried a sense of relief, of recognition. People weren't clapping for a policy. They were clapping for a contrast made impossible to ignore. One man filling the air with noise, the other carving through it with patience. Trump leaned into the microphone, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. That's your problem, he snapped, his tone sharp and unwavering. You sit there, you listen, you ponder, but you never act. I act. I move. I make things happen. You spent nearly a decade talking circles around the people and gave them absolutely nothing in return. Yet, in that very moment, something in the atmosphere shifted. Subtle at first, like a change in wind direction before a storm. His interruptions, once the fuel that set the crowd ablaze, no longer ignited the same fury or fervor. The thunderous applause that had once accompanied his outbursts had turned faint, replaced by scattered claps, half-hearted cheers, and even a few unmistakable groans from weary onlookers who had grown tired of the endless noise. The moderators exchanged brief, telling glances, relief flickering across their faces, as if they could sense the temperature of the room turning. Obama, ever the strategist, did not pounce immediately. He waited. He allowed the silence to stretch, the dust to settle, the crowd to lean in just a little closer. When he finally spoke, his words were not drenched in anger nor sharpened by rage. They were deliberate, steady, and piercing in their calm. "Donald," he began, voice low yet commanding, "there's a difference between action and chaos. It's not about how loud you can shout or how much you can smash apart. It's about whether you're building or just breaking. Anybody can destroy. Anyone can scream. But real leadership is leaving behind something that outlives you, something that stands." The hall erupted, not in division, not in hesitancy, but in a force that rattled the rafters. Applause thundered. People rose to their feet. The sound rebounded from the high walls, filling every crevice of the chamber. It was a standing ovation, and it didn't just belong to a moment. It belonged to a sentiment that had been simmering for far too long. The moderators, despite their attempts to appear neutral, allowed the faintest smile to slip before returning to their notes. Trump's head shook slightly, his lips muttering words the microphone mercifully missed. The cameras, however, caught everything else: the tightening around his eyes, the restless shuffle of his hands, the sudden stiffness in his posture. For the first time that evening, it was not Obama who looked tested, it was Trump. And then, in a move few anticipated, Obama leaned back, said nothing, and simply allowed the waves of applause to wash over the hall. He owned the silence. He didn't need to force the moment. He let it breathe, let it become something larger than words. It was no longer a debate. It was a lesson in restraint, in control, in how the absence of noise can thunder louder than any shout. People who had arrived expecting a brawl found themselves witnessing something altogether different. A masterclass in timing. The moderators eventually gathered themselves, microphones rising. "Thank you. Let's proceed to the next question." But they knew, everyone knew, that they weren't really moving on. They were moving towards something inevitable. The momentum was no longer up for grabs. It was tilting. And then came the moment that would be replayed, reshared, and remembered. The seventh interruption. The next question had barely left the moderator's lips. Something about the burden of leadership in times of division. When Trump lunged forward once more, unable to resist. "Responsibilities?" he barked, his voice cutting like a blade of accusation. "You talk about responsibility? You were a disaster. Weak, dividing this country, leaving it broke and bleeding. Don't sit there and pretend you know anything about unity. Nobody believes you. Nobody." The crowd roared again, but not as it had before. This time, the sound cracked down the middle, cheers and boos clashing like opposing waves. The moderator's pleas for order were nearly swallowed by the noise. One slammed her palm gently against the table, begging for calm. Yet the wave carried on, swelling, spilling over. And then, amidst the chaos, Obama waited again. He didn't shout over them, didn't rush his words. He let the storm rise, crest, and break until only the murmur of anticipation remained. Leaning in slightly, voice as steady as a surgeon's hand, he said, "Donald, if you have to cut me off 6 times in 15 minutes, that doesn't say much about me. It says everything about how afraid you are of what I'm about to say." The eruption that followed was not confused, nor was it divided. It was unanimous, electric, a release of pent-up frustration that had been simmering in the hall since the first interruption. Applause thundered again, deafening, overwhelming, drowning out every other sound. People rose, shouted, whistled. The tension that had knotted their shoulders dissolved in a single strike of wit and composure. Trump blinked. Once. Twice. His lips parting as if to deliver a counterpunch. But nothing came. No retort. No quip. No wall of words to shield himself. The silence that followed him was louder than any line he had delivered all night. Obama didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply folded his hands, leaned back, and let the moment breathe. What followed was not a brief spark, but a rolling thunder. It did not fade. It built. The applause became a force, a rhythm that pulsed through the hall. People in balconies stamped their feet. Older attendees clapped until their palms were raw. Even those who had cheered for Trump earlier now sat with faces etched in reluctant acknowledgement. At home, in Ohio and Michigan and Indiana, television sets flickered with the moment as it replayed in real time. Phones buzzed. Clips spread. The sentence, sharp and undeniable, had already escaped the hall and was racing across the nation. Trump sat rigid, fingers drumming the table, eyes darting to the moderators for rescue that wouldn't come. His lips tightened, his jaw set, his hands fidgeted with his tie, his cufflinks, anything that might disguise the fracture in his composure. Obama remained still, serene even, his expression betraying no triumph, only a quiet, unshakable composure, the kind that comes not from dominance, but from control. The room, once a battlefield, had become his. The moderators pressed forward with their format, insisting on equal time. But equal time had become an illusion. Every word Trump spoke now sounded thinner, hollower, less certain. His accusations about jobs lost, borders open, crime surging, landed with less force, rippling the crowd only slightly before fading into murmurs. Obama, in contrast, spoke like a man who no longer needed to win the crowd. He already had them. Domestic priorities, he said evenly, aren't about slogans. They're about people. They're about families in places like Erie or Toledo or Dayton, wondering if their leaders see them as more than talking points. That's not about noise. That's about results. Applause met his words again. Not the thunderous roar from before, but a steady echo, a sign that the room was now listening rather than reacting. Trump tried once more to claw his way back into the rhythm, his voice rising. Results? You didn't deliver anything. 8 years of talk. Jobs vanished. Borders failed. Crime soared. Everyone knows it. But the room did not roar with him. A few claps, a few nods, but mostly a ripple of uneasy murmurs. The fuel was gone. The strategy had burned out. Obama turned his gaze toward him, then back to the audience. If talking about people's lives is just talk to you, he said softly, then maybe that's the problem. Another surge of applause, louder this time, less a cheer than an affirmation. By then, the moderators were no longer truly steering the event. The audience was. The energy had shifted, not in bursts, but in a tide. And the man who held it was not the one shouting over his opponent, but the one who had silenced the shouting altogether. Hours later, the moment would be everywhere. On news networks, on streaming feeds, on millions of phones replaying the clip again and again. CNN looped it thrice before their panel began dissecting the mechanics of it. Fox News aired it too, spinning its meaning but amplifying its reach all the same. MSNBC branded it boldly. The night Obama stopped Trump cold. And in living rooms from Pennsylvania to Arizona, people weren't just watching. They were recalibrating what leadership looked like in real time. The real impact of that night wasn't from the media channels replaying the footage on loop, but from ordinary people who carried it into every corner of conversation and culture. Within an hour of the debate, social platforms erupted. Hashtags related to Obama's seventh line and Trump's interruptions dominated feeds, trending across Twitter, while TikTok was flooded with edits that dissected and dramatized the exchange. Some were satirical, others were serious, but nearly all circled around one defining image. Obama leaning forward, calm and steady, as Trump, so often the loudest in the room, fell uncharacteristically silent. Instagram Reels replayed it endlessly, accumulating millions of views with captions declaring, "This is how you disarm arrogance," or "The power of composure in action." By dawn, the moment had escaped the political bubble entirely. Screens in diners flickered with the clip as truckers paused over their breakfasts. University students whispered the words to one another in lecture halls. passing phones across rows of seats. In office break rooms, employees mimicked the interruptions and the cool response that followed, laughing but also recognizing something quietly powerful about it. In a small bar in Erie, Pennsylvania, a group of locals leaned over their drinks as the replay aired. One man chuckled, shaking his head. "Never thought I'd see Trump speechless." A woman nearby, her jacket stitched with an American flag patch, added, "That wasn't just a good line, that was control." He didn't need to shout. He owned the whole room without lifting his voice. And in living rooms across the nation, that same sentiment found its way into family conversations. A father in Iowa told his teenage daughter, "See, that's patience. That's what I mean when I talk about real leadership." She laughed and teased him back. "Kind of like when I rant about schoolwork. And you wait until I'm done before saying one thing that fixes everything?" They both smiled, but the point stuck. True influence often comes not from noise, but from timing. By the next morning, the clip wasn't just political content. It had become a teaching moment, a talking point in classrooms, churches, sports teams, even corporate meetings. Coaches referenced it when talking about discipline under pressure. Teachers replayed it as a case study in rhetoric. Late-night comedians built punchlines around it, exaggerating Trump's interruptions before landing Obama's line for the laugh. And yet, the heart of its resonance wasn't humor. It was relief. For a public tired of chaos, of endless shouting matches and interruptions, this moment offered something refreshing. A reminder that calm could neutralize noise, that precision could override bluster. Trump's campaign scrambled to frame it differently. Advisors hit the morning news circuits claiming he hadn't been silenced, only strategic. But the footage told its own story, and the internet does not forget. Even some Republican commentators admitted, quietly, that Obama had scored a hit. One conservative columnist wrote, "Trump has built his identity on dominating the conversation." Last night, for the first time, we saw him dominated. Within a week, the moment was no longer just a debate highlight. It was a cultural marker. Over 150 million views across platforms turned it into something closer to a shared memory. People began to recall where they were when they saw it, sending it to friends with captions like, "This is what strength looks like." Analysts compared it to other historical turning points, moments when a single sentence altered the tone of an entire election season. What lingered wasn't only the line itself, it was the way it was delivered. Steady, unhurried, like a teacher allowing the classroom to quiet down before explaining the lesson. And that was the lesson. That leadership is less about dominating the noise and more about commanding the moment. A retired firefighter in Cincinnati explained it to his grandson. Real strength isn't in who yells loudest. It's in who can stand in the storm without becoming part of it. A pastor in St. Louis echoed the same in a Sunday sermon. You don't always have to match fire with fire. Sometimes you let the blaze burn out. Then you speak truth into the quiet. Teachers across the country told their students to pay attention not just to the words, but to the pauses between them. In a Dallas boardroom, a manager told his team, "We don't need to be the loudest in the meeting. We need to be the clearest." Heads nodded. A marketing lead added, "He showed it. One line, well-timed, can do what 10 interruptions never will." For millions, that moment was not about politics. It became a mirror for their own conflicts, their own frustrations, their own need for control in chaos. They thought of arguments where shouting won nothing, of conversations where restraint could have spoken louder than anger. The contrast between the two men on stage, one interrupting, escalating, pushing, the other waiting, measuring, striking only when ready, made something clear. Patience is not weakness, and composure is not passivity. When paired with conviction, they are power in its purest form. By the end of the week, commentators called it a turning point. Social media called it a mic drop. Ordinary people called it a relief, because it reminded them of something simple. You don't win by being the loudest voice. You win by making the sentence that everyone remembers. And maybe that's the message that will outlive the moment. In a world full of shouting, the words that carry are the ones delivered with intent, not volume.